Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, everybody. Welcome back to my YouTube channel. For this week's video, I want to present another layout design exercise. In this case, as you can see from the diagram that the client sent me, it has a reasonably large basement, but one which has a very awkward shape. In fact, one of the things that he told me during the process was that he had spent several years racking his brains trying to come up with a satisfactory design and had been unable to, which is why he decided to employ me to see what I could come up with in the space available. And the overall size of his space is around 24 feet by about 39. For most of the space, the ceiling is 90 inches high, the exception being the area bounded by the red lines, where he has low-lying ductwork at only 78 inches. And the area bordered by the blue line is the space available for the railroad. The rest of it in the northeast corner is already spoken for, his workshop and utility room. He did, however, point out that there was enough space in the middle of the utility room to put a helix in if necessary. He already knew that he wanted a multi-deck layout, and he was shooting for 3 decks in order to get everything that he wanted. There were some windows in both end walls, which he said were okay if I blocked them. We have the stairs coming down in the middle of the south wall. There's no doorway across it. Next to it, there's a crawl space which he uses for seasonal storage. Again, no doorway. And the opening across from the stairs to the workshop is just a rough opening with no door. So as we can see, there is a fair amount of space in this basement, but a lot of it is not particularly convenient for a model railroad. Most challenging, of course, is going to be this central area with all the circulation routes that have to be kept open and a throat width of only about 65 inches. Now, the client had quite a long want list, including both classification and intermodal yards, large and small cities, small towns, a variety of different scenes, and he wanted a representation of the famous Cisco bridges in Fraser Canyon. Yes, he is Canadian, and he wanted his railroad to include both the Canadian Pacific and the Canadian National, with a slight emphasis on the Canadian National. Now, since this client is already proficient with Third Planet and already had an accurate drawing of his basement, I could go straight into the layout design. And obviously the first task is to see what kind of a footprint and route plan is possible. It was the first sketch that I drew. All the main lines are drawn double per his request. All the curves have a 34-inch minimum radius on the inside with 36 1/4 on the outside. That was a curve radius that he'd already come up with prior to contacting me, having done some experimentation for himself and based on what he liked and didn't like about his previous layout. In this footprint, what I'm trying to do is get a long folded dog bone running from this area at the bottom of the stairs, which looks like is wide enough for a turn-back curve, running around the basement to another turn-back the other side of the crawl space, with only having to cross one of the 3 entrances to the room. Now, unfortunately, with his minimum curve, I can't quite get an S-bend in this south alcove. The best alignment that's going to be possible is somewhere around alignment D, which of course cuts off the whole southern alcove and wastes a lot of space. So then I went to the possibility of just wrapping all the way around the room. Of course, doing it this way requires 3 moving sections. So I did ask him if it was possible to tunnel under and behind the stairs and through the crawl space. He wrote back and said no, that was not going to be possible because there was very little clearance under the stairs. He said there was only 4 stairs on this side, so clearly we were not going to be able to get under them. So I went back to the previous version and I asked him if it was possible to cut through the crawl space with this end curve, allowing a much more economical alignment in this space. He said yes, it was possible, but it would have to be very low. We would not be able to do this on the upper level. So this left us basically having to go back to plan 2, which is this one. So I thought about the possibility of wrapping around in what's referred to as a no-lix with a gradual grade all the way around, eliminating the helix. But that wasn't going to work because the perimeter of his room really isn't long enough to do that, and clearly there is nowhere to put a peninsula to add running distance. So I ended up short of length, bearing in mind, of course, that at least half of the length around here is going to be used up with yards and other areas which really have to be either level or close to it. So I wasn't going to be able to get a continuous grade all the way. Now, although this drawing here looks a bit of a mess, it was used to demonstrate a few possibilities. Now, since we are not able to use a true no-licks plan, we need a couple of laps of helix between each deck. There's two places we can do that, either around here somewhere or in the utility room area. And of course, if we put it in the utility room, we now need two concentric helixes, which is why we have to go to a 4-track formation, which with his minimum radius leaves very little space to walk between the helix and the laundry facilities, and even less maintenance room around the furnace. So that's why I asked about the possibility of cutting through the wall. I'd already noticed that he had 3 metal support posts drawn in beside the wall. So obviously this blue wall down the center was basically just a partition wall. It was not load bearing. And he said he was fine with cutting out whatever sections needed to be gone to make room for the railroad. But looking at the other area, this looks like a more promising space. Obviously there isn't room for a helix fully inside the train room, because otherwise we end up with insufficient space in the aisle, bearing in mind that the west wall is likely to be the only feasible area for his main yard. So we need at least a 3-foot aisle in front of it. On the other hand, by taking out a section of this wall and extending the helix into the workshop area by a couple of feet, we do solve a lot of problems. He did have this area earmarked for a layout control cabinet, but I asked him about it and he was agreeable to moving that elsewhere if I needed this area for a second helix. So anyway, after a little more discussion, we decided to go ahead with this design, wrapping around the room, gaining as much height as we can on each deck, and making up the difference with a couple of laps of helix in the corner by the workshop, and wrapping around the room 3 times. So now it's a case of figuring out what I can get on each deck. And although I had previously thought that it was unlikely that we were going to be able to get everything he wanted, things did eventually fit together quite well. So now let's take a look at the development of the plan and how we decided to use the space. Now bear in mind that this area here by the workshop is where we're going to join the levels together, and then the helix in the utility room is going to take the main line back down from the summit to the staging yard. So we start at the bottom of this helix, run through the middle of the room, and build a nice big staging yard in the northern lobe. The 11-foot width of this area is just about sufficient to get a nice big staging yard here without violating the radius on the inside curve. Although we did later decide that we could drop the hidden radius down a few inches. I ended up going with a minimum of 31 inches hidden with 34 inches visible. Now, since one of the things on his want list was both a large city and a small city, I figured that the small city could go in this corner, and it's going to be a little bit low for convenient operation, so we're not going to make a big deal about it. We're going to put most of the main operating areas on the second deck. We have to cross in front of the crawl space and the stairs. I elected to use this generous size area here for his Fraser Canyon scene. Although he didn't necessarily want a close replica, he just wanted a similar scene inspired by it. He wasn't going to go to the trouble of building a huge arched bridge. Instead, he was going to make use of regular truss bridge and trestle kits. And we eventually renamed it Donald River Canyon instead of Fraser Canyon. The small town that he wanted with a sawmill and forest industries seemed like a good match to fill the rest of this area with. And there is the potential of going through the wall into this space here for a small staging yard for the logging line. Now, as I said just now, all the main operational areas are going to be on the second deck, which of course is at ideal operating height. He wanted 2 yards. The regular classification yard for mixed freight, which I've put on the west wall, and a large intermodal yard, which I've put diagonally in the east room. His intermodal yard had to accommodate a very large container crane, which he had purchased at great expense. And he listed several large industries that he wanted: an ethanol plant, cement works, oil refinery, and grain elevator, along with several smaller ones. I was able to find space for all of them, with the caveat being that the oil refinery is just going to be printed on the backdrop, with nothing more than a couple of loading tracks for 10 cars. And it looked as though this triangular area in this corner is going to be sufficient for engine service and car shops. Bearing in mind, of course, that it is an entirely modern era layout, so we don't have to find space for large turntables or anything like that. It can just be a rectangular building, which is a lot more economical on space. And of course, the route plan of this level follows the bottom one, running around the room counterclockwise, gaining height before leaving to get to level 3. And then here is the top level, where we just make a third lap of the room. I've just drawn a basic double track and indicated a few locations where small towns might fit. And at one of them, there will of course be a junction between the CN and the CP routes, with the CN route dropping back down the helix, back down to staging, while the CP continues to rise to a set of staging loops above the walkway. And if we recall from earlier, the headroom under the air ducts is 78 inches, meaning that we just about have enough space to put the sky staging at 74 inches elevation, giving us adequate clearance for even the tallest of cars, while still giving 6 foot 1 inch walk under clearance. Anyway, after I presented this concept to the client, he was very excited, figuring that I had done what he could not, and was very excited to see how the design could continue. So now it's time to start filling in details. At this point, I did discuss with him turnout choices. Because there is so much curvature on the main line, it was clearly going to be necessary to use a lot of curved turnouts. And for that reason, I recommended fast tracks, because that is the only line of turnouts that has a lot of variety of different curve geometries. And he liked that idea. The plan is that he will purchase the jigs for all the common sizes and just buy the oddball sizes from me. So here is the lower deck with just a little bit more information filled out. I've worked out possible track routes through the canyon area to get the desired effect. Now it turned out that I ended up having to have 2 extra bridges at the 2 ends. So in order to ensure that they weren't all 4 visible in the same scene, I introduced view blocks at the front of the scene at both ends, one here and one at the end. That means that the 2 end bridges can only be seen from a different vantage point from the main central area, to disguise the fact that we've got too many bridges crossing the river too close together. But since the client had already mentioned that he loved bridges, especially big ones, and wanted me to incorporate as many as possible, he saw these extra 2 river crossings as a benefit rather than a setback. Now with the double track main line, notice how the 2 tracks cross each other at this point. So if we have traditional right-hand running on most of the main line, we end up having left-hand running through this small city at the bottom and through the staging yard. Now I broached the idea of having the main lines divide again at this point, so that instead of having a double track continue into the staging area, we have separate single track CN and CP main lines. And he liked that idea, so we'll now have 2 separate staging yards, although I've only drawn the one. And of course it does mean that I now have to find a way of crossing the 2 tracks over each other again before I get to the main helix. And I did come up with a way of combining that with a reversing loop, although I hadn't actually drawn it yet. I will show you that in a later plan. Here is the second level with a little more detail shown. And although neither of us had previously thought that we would have room for a proper passenger terminal, it turned out that there was space for it inside this end curve, where I'd already suggested hiding the tracks under a raised city area. Now it's not going to be particularly good for switching passenger trains. Not only is most of it hidden under a city, with just the end sticking out, but we have a fairly sharp curve all the way through it. And automatic couplers are not going to work well on such long cars on this radius of curve. So we decided we're basically going to have all the passenger trains as just run-throughs. We're not going to do any switching at this point. The client was okay with that. He just wants to run a few long distance passenger trains. He specified 9 cars with 2 locomotives, and the 2 main tracks around here are just about long enough to do that. We could have some shorter tracks curving round in the middle without violating our 34-inch minimum radius curve. But since we're not going to be switching head-end cars, we decided these are going to be for commuter trains. And he also really liked the idea of adding the commuter service. You'll notice that there's one commuter station drawn in near the ethanol plant, and I'll show you later another one I put on the upper deck. In some of the critical areas, I've already incorporated proper size turnouts, whereas in other places, I've just shown approximate alignments. And the other thing that I've been doing during this iteration is working out approximate track elevations. If we go back to the lower level quickly, you can see I started at 24 inches above the ground. I wasn't able to gain as much height in the canyon area as I would have liked because of this over-under arrangement at this point. We're losing 4 inches of potential height gain because of that. I was hoping to have the sawmill at a convenient height for seated operation. At 29 inches, it's still okay, but it's not ideal. Although the whole of the middle deck is at an excellent height for stand-up operation. Now you may notice that some of the reach-in distances are quite large. We had previously discussed this, and the client already has a micromark topside creeper, and he has no problem with these reach-in distances. He has the facilities to get in there over the top of them. Although I am making sure that all operation can be performed from the aisles, and that he only needs a creeper for building and detailing the background scenery and structures. So here is the top level. As I mentioned earlier, I've shown another commuter station here. And since we didn't want to add any more major operational areas on the third deck, we decided we're going to have a junction here, and the commuter trains are going to sneak off into a 2-track staging yard, so they can terminate there instead of on the visible portion of the layout. Not only is this a little high for convenient operation, but we wanted some nice open scenery for the trains to run through, and this is a great place for it, being very close to eye level. I believe this is a typo here. I don't think that's supposed to be 75. I think it's supposed to be 74. So now that all areas of the layout have been roughed in, it's time to start filling in all the details more accurately. But this video has already got long enough, and it's going to take me a lot longer to do justice to the final plan. So I'm going to break it here, and I will continue next week. I hope you've all enjoyed this presentation, and I look forward to seeing you again for the next installment. Thanks for watching, and bye for now.